Welcome again, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Legal Value Network webinar. I am Kate Fries, the meeting manager for LVN. Special thank you to our sponsor, Litera. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few housekeeping notes. Today's session is being recorded. We are using Zoom webinar, therefore attendees will be muted in today's session. We encourage you to use both the chat and Q&A features found on your Zoom controls throughout the session. Use the Q&A feature to ask the presenters questions throughout the webinar and use the chat feature to interact with other attendees. Now, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's session, Sherry Capel from Litera. Welcome, Sherry.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you all for joining us today for our webinar about how a single source of truth helps you to exceed client expectations. My name is Sherry Capel. I'm an evangelist at Litera, and I would love for our esteemed panel to introduce themselves. Casey, why don't we start with you?
Hi, Casey Flaherty. I'm Chief Strategy Officer at Lexfusion, although for most relevant for today's proceedings, my last gig was as head of legal project management at Baker McKenzie, where using single sources of truth was a focal point for our rather large team.
Thank you. Kate?
Sure. So I feel like I should disclose I'm not actually a lawyer, but I've been working with them for a couple of decades now on legal technology, a little bit of everything that's touched every corner of a law firm on the administrative side and within practices. A few years ago, because the world wasn't weird enough in 2020, decided I needed to do something different. So actually stepped out of 2 decades worth of law firm experience to join what was then Foundation, which ultimately became part of the Litera family, with the goal of expanding some of my tech skills, seeing other firms outside of the Chicago market, and really sort of growing in that particular space. And then last year stepped back into law firms. I'm now leading the knowledge and innovation delivery team at Fenwick and West.
Thank you. And Barry?
Thanks, Sherry. So I'm a VP at Litera, but most relevant to today's discussion, I started my career many years ago as a lawyer at Sidley Austin, where I was one of the first 2 lawyers to be given a computer. When I first started practicing, lawyers didn't use computers. And I got the bug. I fell in love with technology and really the intersection of technology and the practice of law. So I left my practice, started a software company, sold it to Lexus a long time ago, almost 20 years ago. I went back to the same firm, Sidley, not to practice law, but on the business side as their chief marketing officer. And that's where I was lucky enough to lure Kate over to the vendor side. And that's how I met Kate. And then I couldn't resist leaving Sidley a second time to go to another software company, Foundation, which really is all about helping firms get to this single source of truth, which is why I'm very interested in the topic today. And then Litera, I ended up here because Litera acquired Foundation. It'll be 2 years this December.
Thank you. So I promised you all it is quite the esteemed panel, and with such diverse perspectives all around all of the sources of truth. So bringing them all together is what we're going to do today. I started my trek into legal tech back as we helped, my organization helped migrate all of you from WordPerfect into Microsoft Office solutions, and think of it as a modern desktop. And it is remarkable to see how the silos of technology, right? The silos of how very dedicated these tools were to doing some one task, how those barriers have broken down so that they now can interoperate and again, bring forth the data that's behind it all. So I think what we're going to do today is we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to ask and pose to our panel a number of questions. They're going to chat about it and comment also. And we're going to begin with the first question. Barry, this is queuing up for you.
Okay.
So Barry, how exactly have the client expectations changed over time? And how has that impacted what law firms need to do to be successful?
Okay, well, some things haven't changed, right? I think buyers of legal services forever have always wanted three key things from outside counsel. They've wanted high quality legal services, price matters, they wanted low cost, right? And they wanted no surprises. In other words, value and predictability. I think what's changed over the years, I explained that I was practicing law before most of you were born, right? Back then, relationships were the key way buyers of legal services ensured they got value and predictability. It was a less sophisticated buyer of legal service who saw building a trusting relationship with outside counsel and really depending on that counsel. I mean, this remembers before the internet, there were perhaps less choices. If you fast forward over the years, buyers of legal services have become more and more sophisticated. They still want trusted relationships. They still want great judgment, but they also expect today facts and data to back things up. I was sitting at a lunch with a general counsel of a very large corporation who said, you know what, I don't want my law firm taking me to a 3-martini lunch or golfing. I want to know the last 6 transactions they've done that are similar to the one I'm doing and to have the information that I need. And the last point I'll make is even over the last 5 or 10 years, because 10, 15 years ago, buyers of legal services have become much more data-driven, fact-based, data-based, right? But they now also expect speed and accuracy in a way that has really risen over the years. So I would guess that's the shift that I've seen.
Casey or Kate, either of you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think that shift from those individual resources or individual reference points are actually having an influence on staffing models for particular matters. So if you think about the way, staffing in olden times, I don't know, Barry, being able to rely on that roster of folks from your local office, your local team, but being able to really think about staffing in a much more broad sense. The last 2 years have been really fascinating. It's the one sort of silver lining of all of this, as it's forced law firms that were perhaps a bit resistant to really understand that you can staff deals, you can staff case teams, you can staff, advisory teams using the full breadth of a firm's resources. You don't have to rely on the same folks that are down the hall from that existing team. You can really look for the right combination of skills, the right experience, and the right capacity to staff those teams. Now, of course, the challenge there, though, is this approach to staffing, that geographic distribution puts a whole lot more pressure on the knowledge and information assets for the firm. It's not the same as standing at the coffee machine and chit-chatting over, when did you last handle this kind of deal, or do you have an example of that kind of provision? Technologies like Teams or Slack or whatever make it easier for us to connect in some ways, but harder in others. There's no such thing as that sort of casual pop-in. It becomes a thing. So you've got to be really, really thoughtful about how you're reaching out and really thoughtful about how you're accessing that information. So that I think is part of the blessing and the curse in terms of this geographic distribution we're seeing.
It certainly delivers improved client service. I can only imagine that right-sizing all of that is benefiting the client as well. Which brings us to the next question. What makes the single source of truth useful? It can be an overused term. But what does it really mean to you and your clients, Casey, or to the firms that you've worked with?
Well, I don't know if it's an overused term. I think it's a term that has different meanings in different contexts. So you can have a single source of truth for a matter, or you can have a single source of truth for the client law firm relationship at the account level. These are related, but they're not the same. And so I think it's a fine term, but we just have to define at which level we're operating. And so at the matter level, it can be matter status, matter tracking, both substantive progress as well as financial progress, progress against budget. Where are we on phases and tasks? Where are we on our timeline, our dependencies? Do we have all the key documents in one place, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that might roll up into what we think of at the account level. What is going on in the relationships? How many matters do we have open? How many of those have budgets? How are we tracking against those budgets? What is our staffing mix? What is our effective rate? There can be parts of it that are a single source of truth that are only for one side or the other. So for the law firm, they might have an expansive view that that includes their business, literally their business. How are we doing on leverage, realizations, collections, et cetera? Not necessarily something that you would make visible to the client, even though it is truth. It's not something that you're going to expose. And so there are different levels at which we're operating and different views in which we're interested. So going back to the matter level, the partner who's overseeing the matter may be interested in a different view than an associate working on one piece of the matter, might be interested in something different than the lawyer at the client who's in charge of it. It's all truth, but how it is filtered really depends on context and role and need. So again, I think it's a great term, but oftentimes we have to say a little bit more so that we can define for our audience what it is that we're talking about.
Thank you.
I really like Casey's point about how the single source of truth depends upon context, and it may be different if I'm part of a legal team working on a matter. And what I thought about as he was explaining that is, you can very often solve a problem for one set of needs. So a legal team needing access to this information, but a subset of that information is needed for other purposes, for strategic planning or diversity or for business development purposes. And where sometimes things break down is when people have blinders on and they're solving. You can imagine the same problem being solved for a bit of information in 3 different contexts, to Casey's point, and for each of those in isolation, it's fine. But then as maybe firm management is looking across the whole firm, they're looking at what supposedly is the same information, but maybe inconsistent. I remember how frustrating it was to ask the same question of different people within a law firm, and you might get different answers. And, that comes back to, we've been talking about accessing information, but there's also the notion of entering information so it becomes a single source of truth. And it's so easy to ask a lawyer over and over again the same information because I need it for this matter, or I need it for this strategic planning purpose, or I need it. And the lawyer's sitting there saying, wait, didn't I just ask someone else on the professional staff and provide that same information? So I really like this notion of context matters when you talk about a single source of truth.
Yeah, the phrase that comes to my mind is, there's your version, there's my version. The truth is probably somewhere in between. And it really resonates in terms of the context being critical. I think the other part of the phrase that we haven't quite touched on is the word single or single source. Law firms have lots and lots of sources, piles, stashes of data or information. And it can be tricky to stitch those together. And I think we'll talk about that in a bit. But with my team, we're tasked with putting the right information into our lawyers' hands in the right context and at the right time. And so we don't have the luxury of running around to all of these different places, on a kind of a scavenger hunt. So that idea of a single source, or at least fewer sources, it's got to be flexible. We've got to be able to pivot and look at that information in the right context from a different perspective. Being able to make that pivot from a single or fewer sources is what allows us to be able to respond, in that, shorter time frame, that higher demand that Barry mentioned in terms of the market expectations.
If Kate's going to pick on a word, single, I'll pick on another word, which is source. I mean, as she was saying that, I was thinking about most firms get something right in terms of the single source of truth, and that's the client matter number. Almost every firm I've ever worked with, they have a single source, a place to go to get the definitive matter number, and that's the firm's time and billing system. That doesn't mean that's the only place it resides. I mean, a document management system needs a list of all of the client matters, but everybody knows, hey, the source of that is this system of record. Even though it may be used in the docket system, it may be used for all sorts of other purposes. So, this notion of what's the source of the information doesn't mean that's the only place that information is being used.
All right. Well, thank you all. So Casey, we're going to move on to our next question. Do you have any examples you can share with our audience today of how the single source of truth has added value for your clients?
Sure. I'm gonna on this one. I'm gonna focus on matter level single source of truth, which is running large transactions, and there being one place where anyone and everyone, including clients, can go to get a view of what is happening in the matter. And again, that is pairing status progress on the substantive matter. How are we doing on the transaction against our timelines with respect to our dependencies? What are our risks and issues if we're hitting or not hitting our deadlines, as well as financial status. There's a lot of clients who are now asking for performance against budget, but that information is hard to parse if you don't actually know how far we've gotten on the matter. So if we're 80% into the matter and we're 60% burn down of the budget, that's good. If we're 20% into the matter and we're 60% burn down of the budget, that's bad. That one number, 60% of the burn down, without understanding what it means, again in context, is not nearly as useful. And so from the client perspective, there's the visible piece, which is they can track the progress of the matter. Are we going to be on time? Are we going to be on budget? And to the extent that's not true in either direction, we're going to be done early, going to be done late, under, over budget. You have better conversations sooner because of it, and that's where there's the invisible part of it to the client. So oftentimes they're not going to dig down into all the checklists and timelines and dependencies, but they're there, and a partner can be equipped to have a higher quality conversation with the client about the progress of the matter, as well as what has changed in terms of assumptions and scope. And to the extent there is going to be a scope change discussion, and often there is for completely comprehensible reasons. It happens sooner rather than later, which is to say before as opposed to after. But even beyond that, and this is the part the clients really don't see, but adds an enormous amount of value, is the better you are at maintaining that single source of truth, the more comfortable the partner is in managing by exception. That is not spending their time figuring out whether things are on or off track, with most of their time being looking after things that are in fact on track because they're checking in on them, but can focus their energy on that which is not going to plan. They can be confident in that single source of truth, and that confidence level is critical, that what's being surfaced as an issue is in fact an issue, and what's being surfaced as on track is in fact on track, and they can focus their attention on that which needs it. And that is an enormous benefit to the partner, but also the client. They hired that partner to lead the matter because of their expertise, not because of their capacity to do an enormous amount of administrative labor, just checking on everything.
Right. And anticipating what would be, beyond that obstacle, it feels like you could get to that sooner as well. So very good. Kate or Barry?
Yeah, Casey talked about it at the matter level. I think if you look at it at the client level, there's an impact as well. And I'm thinking about, this sort of concept of a single source of truth can help to provide some relief, mitigate the impact of really complex organizations. I've worked at firms where there are, several different practices that actually do acquisition work. The M&A folks, the private equity folks, the energy folks, the insurance practice, all of those lawyers are handling really complicated acquisitions, divestitures, and strategic acquisitions, and so on. If we looked at that in a very sort of org chart perspective, the folks in the M&A practice wouldn't be able to benefit from the experience of, or the work product samples, or even the budgeting experience from any of those other practices. So being able to look at that, and again, it goes back to context, understanding what is that piece of work and who are the people involved, and being able to look at it either through the lens of the type of the work or from the type of people involved, to understand the difference there can be pretty critical and pretty valuable for the firm. You think about potential cost drivers for an M&A deal. Did it involve complex executive compensation discussions? Did it involve antitrust clearance? So looking at the type of work, but also understanding the type of people involved, helps you figure out where those differences are, where those impacts might be.
Yeah, I mean, listening to talking about this information at a matter level, and then looking at a lens that is broader at a client level, I can't help but think about, when I was a young lawyer before a lot of this technology, we did reuse work product, but that was almost always a document, and, or getting to a lawyer you talk to. Today, this data can be very valuable on a particular matter, but then when you aggregate data across matters, if that data is collected in a consistent way, some of the things that both Casey and Kate were talking about, which is, are we off track with this? Well, if you're able to say, we've done a lot of matters like this, what is similar to what we've done in the past and what is dissimilar, that can only be done if you have, it's not just a single source of truth for a particular bit of information, but looking at taxonomies, looking about how do we talk about matters and stages. Casey talked about, hey, just one bit of information, which is where are we at in the budget, isn't helpful if I don't know where I'm at the matter. But how do I compare that if I don't have a frame of reference? Now, I think lawyers have always done this, but they've done it intuitively. They'll tell the client we're on track, or whereas with this coming together of data, with the, we talked about clients wanting more fact-based, data-based responses. Yes, they want the judgment and the intuition, but if you can couple that with facts and data, you can only do that if you're speaking the same language, right, across these historic matters.
Exactly. All right. So our next question, Kate, you're going to kick us off on this one. What cultural challenges have you encountered when implementing single source of truth systems and processes? And how did you overcome those challenges?
Sure. Well, we've alluded to the fact that there are these sort of disparate sources within a given firm that have evolved over time. Most of them kind of grown up in silos or developed for a very specific purpose. Billing systems are well tuned at, capturing time, issuing bills, capturing cash, reporting on cash. That's what they're designed for. Similarly, conflict system or new business intake system or docket systems, they have a very specific focal point. And then the people that own them, right, that are the business owners or the administrators of those systems, have a vested interest in making sure that they're protecting those assets, that those assets are correct and complete and so on. What I found is, connecting the technologies can be hard, and getting all the data to line up neatly can be a challenge. But what I found to be trickier is making the connections with the people. Those relationships, those different data sources are all owned by different domain experts, people that have made their careers on managing and delivering these specific data sets, if you will. And a lot of those folks are really uncomfortable with the idea of the truth depends, and that's okay. That degree of ambiguity can be a little scary sometimes. And it's also kind of a challenge to help folks understand it's possible for data to be correct in one context, but not quite right at the same time. That doesn't make it wrong. It doesn't make it bad. Data isn't inherently bad. It just is. And so really having the ability to create those relationships with the people, in addition to being able to connect the systems, is pretty critical. And it, as I was thinking through sort of sketching out some notes, it really comes down to trust. And I know that sounds a little bit trite, but, the idea of building that trust between teams, and if you're responsible for connecting those dots against those different systems, you've got to be able to demonstrate that you can be a good steward for that information. When I joined Barry's team at Sidley more than 10 years ago now, our team had a not so great relationship with some of the teams in finance in terms of, being able to get access to data and that kind of thing. And for good reason. Like, there had been some missteps and mistakes made along the way. And the very first goal on my very first, 90-day how's it going check-in was make them like us, help them like us. And so went about really building that relationship, demonstrating that we could be good stewards, that we could be trusted, that we understood what the nuances were from the finance team's perspective, so that we were presenting information in the correct context, and that we were being, thoughtful about how those things got stitched together. So I think really the biggest challenge in making these connections is that relationship, is helping, make sure that your colleagues in each of those different areas understand why that connection is important, how it's relevant, and how we're all sort of working together, if you will. Demonstrating that you're hearing them and understanding their perspective is really key to making that work.
So it's the technology is the easy part, right?
Relatively speaking, yeah, it really is.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add just a nuance there, which is, and Kate was very good at this at Sidley. And I think my observation, looking at hundreds of firms implementing solutions, you tend to have people who are so focused on their solution and it doesn't go well. If you go in with, I'm going to explain to you the problem I'm solving, and I'm going to explain to you the data that I need, and I'm going to explain to you what you're going to have to do to feed whatever, right? If the old saying, seek first to understand. If you go and you listen and you ask good questions and you find out, okay, how do they look at the data? What are they doing? And it could be, ideally, maybe there's something in the project that you're doing that could actually be a benefit. But even if you can't get to that level, at least you can have a conversation about, do no harm. This is not, this is going to help the firm as a whole, because everybody, when it's in a firm, wears kind of two hats. They're focused on their, whatever the function is, but yes, they're part of the firm as a whole. And, the ideal situation is if your project where you need something, from somebody else actually gives them something in return. That's perfect, right? But it's not always the case. So then you have to appeal to, hey, this is the right thing for our lawyers, for our clients, for the firm, for whomever, even if in the context of that particular department, yes, they're going to be sharing some information. But I say you start with listening and understanding, which I think is just expanding on what Kate was saying.
Yeah. Right. So our next question, Kate, is what specific solutions have you seen implemented to turn to create an actionable single source of truth?
Sure. So, Casey talked about a great example of that 60% run rate. And, while it's true in different contexts, sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes that's a bad thing. I want to talk, provide like a slightly different example. If you think about the word client, in a law firm, seems like a fairly straightforward term, the client is the client. But if you sort of walk through an example with me, let's say, you're at a firm and Tech Giant Inc. is one of your particular clients. Your litigators are busy with a series of product liability cases. Your M&A partners are busy negotiating the terms of their next strategic acquisitions. Your trademark team is navigating whatever the USPTO has thrown at them for the latest clearance filings. Everyone is busy servicing different pieces and parts of Tech Giant Inc. You look at the financial system, there's probably 24 individual billing codes that are Tech Giant Inc., all with the same billing address, all with the same e-billing codes and such, but each with their own 5 or 6 digit client code. And then there might be a parent client or a related client or whatever your financial system calls it. And that umbrella client also includes subsidiary A, subsidiary B, and so on. So what is the client from a data perspective? We're going back to, it depends, right? The trademark partner reporting to their IP counterpart in-house, the client is that individual client code, or that individual billing number that all the trademark numbers fall under, or all the trademark work falls under. For the M&A partner, looking to identify what other firm services the business folks at Tech Giant Inc. might benefit from, that corporate strategy, who else, what other services could the client benefit from? The client is really the collection of all of those individual billing codes that reflect Tech Giant Inc. as an entity. So you've got to look at that sort of across that full relationship. And then if you're the rainmaker looking at managing and growing the relationship overall, you're looking at the whole picture. So Tech Giant Inc. plus subsidiary A plus subsidiary B. So really, those are 3 different completely valid and correct definitions of the idea of a client or the client, but they're really different depending on that context. Depending on what business problem you're trying to solve, depending on who you are, there's one version of the truth that's relevant to what you're doing. At Fenwick and in my past life, we've leveraged Foundation to create that single source of truth that allows us to pivot around the concept of client to get at the right answer in the right context. We're able to see detail at the individual billing net level. We're able to see detail at the overall client plus subsidiaries, family level. And we're also able to create that roll up or unify that roll up of those individual client codes to be able to see everything across a specific entity or specific company. So that's a really specific way that we've been able to connect those dots with a particular solution, so that the truth, depending on your perspective, depending on the question you're trying to answer, is available in that single source, but you just can, pivot, look at it through the window on the side, as opposed to the door on the front, et cetera.
Got it. Casey or Barry, anything to weigh in on that?
Well, yeah, so information is data organized so as to be useful for decision making. And there are different decisions that need different pieces of data organized different ways. And understanding who the audience is for data and what decisions they need to make is extremely important, because it's not just whether or not it's true, although that's foundational. Very pardon the pun. It's but is it presented in a way that makes sense to them? And part of that sense making, it includes limiting what is presented to that which is actually important. It is very easy to lose clarity because we get distracted by seductive details that are actually extraneous. And so choosing what not to present is a key decision, along with what we're presenting and how we're presenting it.
Very good.
The one thing I will add, kind of a slightly different direction, which is getting to a single source of truth across the firm's various sources of data, so that you have easier access. What's very interesting is, because your question was, what specific solutions have you seen that have provided value, turned into actionable? And Casey, I think, correctly points out that a big part of that is supporting decisions. And what I think is really interesting is that you can much more quickly get to the question or the problem, to a solution to that, when you have and again, I'm going to use the foundation of that information. So just one example, a client talks to a partner and is facing, a situation where they need to make a decision about, whether or not to give up something in a particular negotiation. Well, if as a byproduct of all of the prior similar deals that lawyer has worked in, that at their fingertips they can find out, hey, here's the state of the market as a whole, but with this particular party, here's what we've seen. And it kind of helps educate those decisions. And I think there's other examples, maybe clients asking about diversity, which requires information from a lot of different places. And in the past, you might get the question and then you start from scratch to say, okay, I need to go over here to get that information and over there to get that. As we move towards, hey, we know where our information is. We know where to go to find out who our diverse partners are and who's billed what on where. And we've got access to that information. And it's almost like, who knows what decisions a firm is going to need to make. They never thought they would have this merger opportunity, right? But instead of starting from scratch, if they have this single source of truth, they're able to find out, okay, well, how good of a fit are we? Where are we going to conflict? Is there going to be some fallout? What are the geography implications? And on and on. So I think that part of this is moving away from saying, hey, I've got this problem. I need to create a whole new style, a whole new technology to solve that problem, because I have a way of making decisions that are data-based, fact-based, because I have that resource, which is a single source of truth.
Yeah, and I just want to circle back to something that Casey said, and really putting the emphasis on the idea of actionable, right? Like, anyone can produce a pie chart, and with the advent of easier access to creating dashboards, we've got people putting pie charts all over the place. But it's really easy, and Casey, I am going to steal the phrase "seductive details" as I'm talking to my team. I'll credit you with the source, but I'm often talking to my team about being relentless editors. Really focusing on what is relevant, what's important, and how does that detail, how does that piece of information support the action that we need to be able to take. It's easy to push information to people. It's easy to push data at people. I think we saw that 10 years ago with the easier access to reporting, right? I can push a report to you. Here's a table of columns of rows and numbers and letters and so on. But really shifting to that actionable focus, requires you to focus on what those key elements are. Less is more in a lot of ways, because it's too easy to get distracted by those additional details. Really focusing on, what is this piece of information telling me? What action can I take based on this piece of information? And if it's there just because it's curiously or intellectually interesting, maybe not on the front page, maybe not above the fold, but really focusing on what's actionable and relevant.
Very good, thank you. So this last question, each of our panelists are going to weigh in on. And so the question is, if you were talking to someone who was doing this for the first time, what's the one key thing you would share? Barry, why don't you go first?
Sure. I guess I'd start by, explaining, of course, achieving a single source of truth requires breaking down silos. And the obvious silo to break down is data. But the importance is going beyond that, realizing it's silos, as you said, Sherry, earlier, among technology solutions, but it's also silos among people and departments and geographies, as Kate described. And I hadn't thought about it until Casey said, but it's silos among different contexts. Hey, here's how I work with this for matters, but I'm doing it in a completely different way in another context. So I think that understanding that, and at the end of the day, and I guess we did talk about it a bit earlier when we were talking about the cultural barriers and how to overcome them, I think that if you invest the time at identifying these different silos, which is often people and geographies, systems, and not just go immediately to the obvious stakeholders, but maybe especially identify those not so obvious stakeholders and listen. I think that would be my key advice.
Very good. Casey.
Yeah, well, I think Barry was talking about data stakeholders or various stakeholders who it's necessary to get their contribution for systems to talk to each other, for them to contribute. Before I did that, I would start with the main stakeholders who are the audience. Understanding who the audience is for what we're trying to do and what their highest priorities are. Because we can do a million different things, but it's for all intents and purposes, it's infinite what we could do in terms of how we could slice the data, how we can present it. And we are going to run into roadblocks on getting certain things into the system, and we need to be sure that we're not majoring in the minors. And it all comes down to who is that audience and what is going to best meet their needs, and frankly, what do we need to get to for it to be a minimal viable product? That is, what is that threshold for usefulness for the audience, so we don't roll it out too early or too late, and what is required to get there, because we are often guilty of over engineering and not doing enough user interviews such that what we deliver requires an enormous amount of effort, but does not satisfy expectations or needs. And part of that dialogue is not just to surface needs, but it's to properly set expectations, because if you just go with the surface level, well, what do you want? And the answer is everything. When do you want it? Now. And to really dig down into what is actually going to make a difference, and that's all easier said than done, but that's what webinars are for. Giving advice that's easier said than done.
Thank Thank you.
So extending on that super easy to give advice sort of metaphor, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of taking it to that next step. My suggestion would be, not only talking to your stakeholders, understanding what it is that they need, but literally spending as much, if not more time on thinking about the results, the outputs you need to produce in order to meet those needs, rather than focusing on the inputs. I learned a long time ago never to walk into a task force, a working group, a committee, a subcommittee with a blank piece of paper, because you will walk out with an 83-layer outline that gets you absolutely nowhere, or an 8-page input form that requires 6 months to fill out and still gets you nowhere. I think really before you dive into the inputs, the fields, the lists, the forms, whatever, giving really careful thought to how your audience is going to use that information. What business questions are they trying to answer? What actions do they need to take? What combination of data points will they have to pull together to search to get the answers that they need? Understanding how it might come together really will inform how you go about building the blocks to get there. An input form, I've seen this time and again, where if the team focuses on the input form exclusively, you'll end up with a really slick form with 20 fields and very complex if-then logic to make it really easy to fill in the blanks. But then you have to explain to a senior associate or a partner which combination of 14 fields do you use in this circumstance and 13 fields do you use in that circumstance. And they never use it. And then you're puzzled. Why aren't they engaged? Why don't we have adoption? Really thinking about how it's going to get used in real life by real people should inform how you tackle it as you go along. To lean into some of my favorite Barryisms, you got to start with the end in mind. If you know where you're going, it's actually easier to get there. And at some point, you got to start somewhere. If you start collecting data today, a year from now, you'll have a year's worth of new data or new information or making those combinations, but really thinking about how is it going to get used and let that inform how you approach getting there.
Okay, thank you, Casey and Barry. There is, we're kind of queuing up here for our questions, and there's one that just kind of jumped out. Have each of you done any sort of, think of it like an education to those people that you're going to get those insights from? Do you teach them what sort of information you're looking for, or is it really your job to sort of edit through what they're saying to mine what is the jewel to help you get to that destination? I'm just really curious how that happens, the user inputs.
Carefully. Be careful what you wish for and ask for, but you still have to ask, right? Better to know. I think, the other Barryism that applies, feedback is a gift. However it becomes packaged, feedback is a gift.
Yeah, and harking to what Casey said, which is MVP, start with the least that you need to, and then iterate. And people will learn along the way. People really like to be part of the process. They don't like for somebody to come from up high and have something really complicated they're doing. If you can, hey, I'm entering some information. I mean, I like to always say lawyers prefer using a red pen than a blue pen, right? They prefer to edit something. And if you're going to give them something, knowing that it's, we need more, what do they need, right? But let them interact with it. People learn by doing, I think. I think it's really difficult to just make them get it.
I'm all for, maturing from we're doing this to you to we're doing this for you to we're doing this with you.
Love that.
And you certainly need to achieve that. But at a certain point, the people doing the work should be more informed about the thing that they're doing than the person that they're talking to, the same way that the person that they're talking to knows more about the work that they do. And to the extent you're there to help improve their work, you need to understand what they do, but you should also shape their thinking about what it is that you're doing with them. You know, specialization is a hallmark of sophistication, and if this is an area where you are the specialist, you should take the opportunity to educate and shape without ever losing sight of the collaborative nature, not making it too didactic, let alone dictatorial. But still, it's not just being passive and saying thank you, all of your ideas are brilliant, let me now go try and affect all 83 pages of them.
Well, in building off of a theme from earlier, which is context. I mean, people who are designing, building, implementing these types of systems, it's not just telling people what information to be entered, but rather, you know, as Kate said, start with the end in mind, providing the context of the why and what's in it for them, and providing value, not just here's how you do it, X, Y, and Z, right?
Right. So with that, I'm just going to reach out to Kate Fries, who is our session moderator here, and just make sure, do we have any additional questions from the audience?
I am not seeing any here yet, but on that note, if you do have any questions you'd like to ask the panel, please do so in the Q&A tab, or you can even add it to the chat box as well, whatever works.
All right, well, thank you. So do our panelists have anything very specific that you want to make sure that our audience takes away from this? An actionable next step.
I think it's useful to keep in mind, you know, that a single source of truth concept doesn't have to be a huge investment in a big new giant thing. You know, it can be really that concept can be applied both in big and small ways. Being able to put together, you know, a smart spreadsheet that does the math and really looks at things from the right angle can be just as powerful as introducing, you know, a new, like, fully fleshed out experience platform. Really thinking about it in context and figuring out, like, what are those business problems, what are those challenges that people are trying to wrestle with, and how can that truth, from whatever angle you're looking at it, really help to answer those questions.
Very good, thank you. Barry or Casey, any other parting thoughts?
Yeah, so it doesn't all have to be done at once. Can be just one click at a time. Have we reduced the user journey by one click to get what they want to get? Now, sometimes you really do need to do a full system redesign in order to have the architecture to make that possible, and knowing the difference between incremental improvement and the need for total redesign is an important distinction to make. But there are lots of cases where you can make that incremental improvement at a very low cost, but a very high ROI. And zealots, converts make the greatest zealots, and you start to improve people's lives, and they want more of it, and they can become your champions. And again, that's context specific, and you have to be the master of your own context. But really do try and become the master of your context, and understand who your stakeholders are and what moves them.
Wonderful.
And I'll just add on to that, you know, understanding your stakeholders means understanding what their needs are. So if they ask for something and you're offering it up, to be able to think about, I mean, the ideal thing is to think about the needs that they may not even be asking about, because you understand what their pain is. I know as a practicing lawyer, I would do things over and over again, assuming it couldn't be better. And if someone were to come in and point out, I know you asked for this particular thing, but did you know? And that's this notion of earning a convert, right?
Mm-hmm.
Providing value with the. I mean, it's such a huge asset of firms. I think firms understand that now, that data is an asset that can provide value both to the firm itself as well as the client.
Yes. Well, I get to have the privilege here of thanking each of you for sharing all of your wonderful insights and guidance on this journey to the single source of truth. We really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye all. Thanks.
Bye.